The recent steep rise in prices seems to be cooling off for now, at least in some categories. While costs for certain grocery items remain high, other areas like gas and electricity are showing a drop in cost over the last few months, according to a Consumer Price Index summary released last month by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. While this is great news in the short term, many experts believe the country is still not out of the woods when it comes to inflation and supply chain issues.
The recent decline in inflation, it's still high. There's no question about the fact that it's still high. Even with the recent decline, it's still 7.1% on a year-over-year basis. That's how it's calculated, which is quite high.
That's James Rickards, an economist and former investment banker who worked in capital markets on Wall Street for more than 40 years. He argues that inflation stems from two separate causes.
Inflation can come from the supply side, shortages of goods, people looking for things, bidding up the price because they can't get enough, et cetera, which is what we've experienced. It can also come from the demand side, which basically is more psychological. It's consumers worried about price increases and saying, oh, gee, I was going to buy a new dishwasher. There's no hurry, but boy, the price is going up. I better go out and buy it right now before the price goes even higher. They're very different in the sense that when inflation comes from the supply side, without more, it tends to extinguish itself. There's an old saying in economics that the cure for high oil prices is high oil prices, meaning at some point people use less or drive less or unemployment goes up and you're not even buying gas, not because it's expensive, but because you're out of work, for example. Whereas the demand side inflation tends to feed on itself. It gets worse and worse and worse.
Two major factors that are feeding into our supply chain and inflation woes are playing out overseas. One is the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine that's heavily affecting energy and gas prices, as well as the global food supply of key grains like wheat and corn. The second issue stems from a large COVID surge currently playing out in China. The country, a major supplier of goods, is still experiencing a large number of COVID cases following an abrupt loosening of pandemic restrictions, leading to millions of workers calling out sick. These delays lessen supply and increase demand, resulting in higher prices. On top of these well-known causes, Rickards points out how trade wars in the years preceding the pandemic are also to blame. He highlights one example from 2018.
Trump put tariffs on imports, appliances and solar panels, solar modules. In theory, it applied to everyone, but it was targeted at China because they were the main supplier of both categories. But then China retaliated. And what they did, they had been buying the two biggest soybean producers in the world are the United States and Brazil. And the biggest soybean importer is China because they need the food. So China moved their soybean purchases from the U.S. to Brazil as a kind of retaliation. Well, that's a big deal. And then the U.S. soybean farmers were like, well, what do we do with our soybeans? Well, they found a market in the Netherlands, and all of a sudden we're shipping soybeans to the Netherlands, and you're using, the port of Savannah or Port Elizabeth near New York instead of the port of Los Angeles, et cetera. So that simple policy decision by Beijing in retaliation for Trump's original tariff decision scrambled food supply chains all over the world. And I could give 50 other examples.
Rickards says these challenges are naturally what happen in global trade systems. International relations and domestic markets are always in flux, and it's only a matter of time until something comes up that we couldn't fully prepare for.
When you stretch your supply chains 9,000 miles from Chongqing to New York or from Shanghai to Amsterdam, et cetera, you create so many linkages, so many transportation lanes, so many handlers, so many things that can go wrong, either politically, weather-wise, wars, vessel sinks, et cetera. Just more and more things that can go wrong. And those hidden costs accumulate. And that's been around the whole time. And experts have said, well, okay, we'll have two suppliers and we'll have backups and all that. So a lot of that was thought about and done. I'm not suggesting that no one ever encountered that. But as the system got larger and larger, scaled to a larger size, more complex, more stretched, these vulnerabilities began to outweigh the benefits.
So, what can the U.S. do to better protect its citizens from higher costs or a lack of supply for certain goods? Rickards argues that there needs to be a greater focus on making our supply chain system more resilient by ramping up production within our borders.
You actually need to shorten the supply chains, reduce the participants, reduce the complexity, et cetera. That will add some costs, possibly not automatically, but could add costs. But those costs will be worth it because you'll be more resilient, more robust, and have fewer disruptions of the kind we're seeing now.
One example of this is a recent move by one tech company.
So the largest and most sophisticated semiconductor manufacturer in the world is a company called Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, TSMC for short. They're based in Taiwan, of course. And they make, again, the cutting edge 5 nanometer, 2 nanometer semiconductors. In recent months, they've announced $40 billion of new investment in 4 separate, what are called semiconductor fabrication plants, or so-called fabs, building 4 fabs at $10 billion each or more in Arizona.
While the move might look strange and costly, doing so allows them to continue their business in the U.S. even if exports from Taiwan were cut off, which would help prevent a total shortage of vital electronics here at home. To find out more about this topic and our guest, James Rickards, visit viewpointsradio.org. Also, check out his book, Sold Out: How a Broken Supply Chain, Surging Inflation, and Political Instability Will Sink the Global Economy. Available online and in bookstores. This story was written and produced by our executive producer, Amira Zaveri. I'm Gary Price. This segment is brought to you by the Capital One Venture X card. Earn 10x miles on hotels and rental cars and 5x miles on flights when you book through Capital One Travel. Plus 2x miles on all other purchases. Capital One. What's in your wallet? Terms apply. See CapitalOne.com for details. Coming up on Viewpoints.
Western women, they consider themselves mainstream American women who were just taking advantage of the opportunities that the West gave them.
We travel back to the Wild Wild West. Then,
the basic core system hasn't been upgraded since the turn of the century, so 23 years ago.
Is flight technology stuck in the 20th century? I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows and find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints.